as you probably are aware, there's been a lot of debate about mātauranga Māori in the school curriculum, and it'd be really interesting to get, first of all, your take on that, and also, what for our listeners mātauranga Māori really means.
Okay, so I'll start a bit with a little bit of my background, just so you listeners know the perspective I'm coming from. So I was born and raised in a rural Māori community, a place called Te Kaha, which is in the Eastern Bay of Plenty, probably about 90% Māori community. Quite deeply immersed in Māori culture, as deep as it can get. So we grew up right next to a marae. Māori language was a regular part of our upbringing, Māori culture and all aspects of Māori culture, but also just the practical ways of living in our small Māori community. Things like hunting and fishing and diving and still a bit of living off the land that goes on there. And a lot of old protocol and tikanga are still maintained in places like this. So that's the world I grew up in. And I've lived in Wellington for half of my life as well. So I kind of have this rural, urban Māori, in a way, is quite a unique perspective, I think. And fast forward to today, my main job is I work in mostly primary school communities, where I teach what I'd call mātauranga Māori, which is a whole raft of things. So I teach Māori performing arts, Māori tikanga and protocol. I teach Māori language to students as well as teacher groups. And through that and through teaching Māori performing arts, you also teach things like history. I mean, we learn about important times in New Zealand history, like urbanisation, which I don't think is talked about
right.
as much as it should.
That's kind of the post-World War II era,
right,
when lots of Māori moved from rural areas, especially to South Auckland, but other urban areas as well.
Yeah, it's when all Māori flocked to the cities, and there's a big cultural shift around that time. So we learn about all of these things. So there's a bit of history. I try and teach about things like Māori attitudes and views on certain things, Māori cultural beliefs. I also try and do that in the most objective kind of way, in a way that I'm not, pushing views onto students and stuff as well.
Yeah.
So that's my job. But to answer the question, what mātauranga Māori is, I think that there's a simple answer, and there's probably two ways to answer that. The direct translation is probably Māori knowledge. But I think a better translation, a more accurate translation of mātauranga Māori for me is a Māori cultural perspective. Because mātauranga Māori, when we're talking about mātauranga Māori, it includes a whole plethora of things. It includes all the things I'm talking about. It includes language, protocol, tikanga, history.
Hunting and fishing?
Everything, the Māori world. And so that's why I think, a Māori cultural perspective is a far more accurate.
Yeah, one term I like to use is Maori traditional lore, like LORE, because I think that word can encompass kind of know-how, but also sort of songs and myths and things like that.
Yeah. I think the trouble when we use knowledge, it depends what we mean by knowledge. So is it, what do they call it? There's the two kind of perspectives on knowledge. One that includes, a more relativist approach that includes spiritual beliefs, and religion is encapsulated in that. And then there's the more scientific understanding of knowledge.
Yeah, so I guess in the Western mindset, we distinguish knowledge from belief.
Right.
And if of course, where all of this got terribly fraught in education is the question of mātauranga Māori and its relationship to science. And of course, as a way of understanding the world, science is very much focused on the objective and finding out, all about the natural world in ways that can be defended with evidence. And I would argue that science became possible because of that split in I guess, that started in Europe between understanding of the natural world and then spiritual understanding on the other hand. Whereas I'm not sure that ever was a thing, like that division was ever a thing in Māori world.
No, I agree. I don't think there ever was a division there. It's all part of the same kind of body of cultural understanding. And exactly that's where we've kind of run into trouble, where like the supernatural aspects of mātauranga Māori have been started to be included in things like science class, which is a huge problem.
Yeah.
So do you think there are some aspects of Mātauranga Māori? I mean, we talked about songs and myths; they're also part of Mātauranga Māori. But are there some parts of Mātauranga Māori that are science or something like it? Because people make claims like, well, there's lots of knowledge of local plants, so native plants of New Zealand, and so it could be that Europeans came here and Western scientists didn't know about certain features and certain properties of local plants that sort of Maori traditions knew about. That's one area that people talk about in terms of science and Mātauranga Māori. Another thing that people say a lot is, well, the Polynesians, of course, were great seafarers, and they used the stars and they used the currents, and so that may have been a kind of science. What do you think about those kinds of claims?
Well, on Polynesian navigators and seafarers, I think they're absolutely, even at the time, some of the best seafarers across the globe.
Given the size of their boats, they traveled an incredibly long way and found these tiny little bits of land in a vast ocean. So you've got to say they were pretty good at it.
Right. And I think in the broad sense of science, I think those kinds of things are absolutely science. And things like that, they needed to be pretty accurate. So they needed to be tested. And if they didn't work, people died. They didn't arrive at their destination. So they had to be pretty accurate. So I know, I spent a little bit of time on waka haurua, which are the modern interpretations of traditional Polynesian seafaring canoes. And I know a little bit about that world and observed some of the navigators, and they're pretty. I'd consider what they do very scientific. But that's one aspect of mātauranga Māori. When we're talking about mātauranga Māori as a whole and comparing it to science, that's where we run into trouble. But sure, I think there are aspects of mātauranga Māori that I think we could comfortably say is knowledge and is some of it scientific knowledge.
Yeah, you said about those navigational techniques that those were tested, and I'm sure that must be true. I guess I'm a trained scientist, and I guess one of the things about science is that it tests knowledge in a particular way using kind of systematic experiment. And I suppose there's no way to know for sure whether those early Polynesian navigators were using an experimental method or whether it was more trial and error over successive generations where the knowledge was handed down and modified. And if it's that, then perhaps by a strict definition, it's not the same as science. That's not to say that it isn't of equal stature in terms of the achievement. But if you're thinking about putting together a curriculum for school science, it might matter how the knowledge was tested, not just that it was tested.
It brings me back to a traditional philosophical definition of knowledge, which is justified true belief. And Oliver Traldi, who was associated with Heterodox Academy, the American consortium of academics who are in favor of viewpoint diversity and free speech and stuff like that, he wrote an article a while ago because John Haidt, who founded Heterodox Academy, had come out and said, the purpose of the university is truth. And, it's a truth-seeking institution. And Oliver Traldi was like, oh, I think that's true, but I have a little tweak. And the little tweak was, no, universities are about knowledge, right? And it sounds like a very kind of not very important nuance. But his point was universities are about instructing students not only about what is true, but about how we arrive at the truth. And so what you really want is to teach them about justify true belief, and how you justify belief, how you are able to ascertain that something is a belief is not only true, but also, how you know it's true.
Right.
Yeah. So just to pick up Michael's question then, so is there that element of mātauranga Māori? Is there like methodology in it in terms of empirical investigation?
I don't think it's in a strict scientific sense, but like I said before, in that general sense where there's observation, there's testing, whether it's over generations through trial and error, like Michael pointed out. There's that element of it, absolutely. I'm not sure if cultures can survive without some level of that.
I agree. There's no culture in the world that hasn't had that, or it wouldn't survive. Yeah.
But when you're saying that's comparable to science as a methodology, or even as a body of knowledge, it's simply not the same thing.
I did have someone claim to me recently, who wasn't Māori, by the way, and I'd be interested in your take on this, that with some of the agriculture that Māori got into, growing kumara and the like, that they used essentially an experimental approach to figure out where the best spots were to grow kumara and other crops. Do you know anything about that?
Not really. All I know is that in the warmer parts of the country, it grew better, and in the further south you got, it was a bit harder to grow.
Yeah, I mean, I've even seen this as a possible reason why there were relatively few Maori in the South Island traditionally, right?
I think that is one of the main reasons.
I think still today it's like 90% of Maori on the North Island. I mean, most of the population, the total population,
most of New Zealand's population,
it's even more extreme with Maori. And I read that was precisely because of kumara and other crops that they brought from the sort of warm waters of the Pacific wouldn't grow in the South Island. At least, once you sort of get beyond sort of Golden Bay and areas like that, the tip of the North Island, it's very difficult to grow them. But Michael, so what you're talking about there is that, because I mean, I know some scientists who would say at this point, well, there's a difference between just trial and error and an experimental method.
Yes, and the claim made to me was that they were indeed using an experimental method with the crops. Now, I'm not sure how we'd know if they were or they weren't, unless there was something written down or handed down some other way. And I haven't seen whatever evidence it is for that myself, but I was wondering if Henare may have more insight into that.
No, not on that particular. Whether they were using an experimental approach when they were growing kumara. No stories off the top of my head.
Yeah.
What I do know is that once potatoes were introduced, Māori adopted the growing of potatoes pretty readily. They grew easier. There was less ceremony and tapu around potatoes, and they kind of took off, along with other introduced sweet potato, other types of kumara as well.
Mm-hmm.
That's actually an interesting moment in itself, isn't it? Because, I mean, we're often told about Maori tradition and how important it is to preserve Maori tradition. And I do think it's important for peoples to preserve their traditions. But that suggests to me that Maori have also always been quite innovative. They've been on the lookout for new things, new crops, new techniques. And when those new crops, new techniques look good, then they eagerly embrace them.
Yeah, they do. And this is one aspect, I think, of the broader subject of colonization that doesn't get talked about much. Is you got to remember, in those early times, Māori were the dominant in terms of number.
Yeah,
were the dominant people, and so it wasn't. I mean, if you know much about Māori culture, it wasn't easy to force things on Māori, especially in those times.
Yeah,
they weren't meek people. There to be
they've never had that reputation.
No. But, from history, it's pretty clear that Māori consciously adopted a lot of these things. And kumara is just one example.
I guess another would be literacy, right? Like the reading and writing was picked up pretty eagerly, pretty quickly. Yeah.
And muskets as well. Slightly more controversial example. But I mean, in a way, it shouldn't be controversial, right? Because it's like, most humans across the world in historical times have fought with one another and, fought against their neighbors, basically. And I think, all over the world, when guns were introduced, people, adopted them, and they North American Indians adopted not only guns, but also horses, and they used them against the white man and used them against each other. So it's kind of unsurprising that Maori would would eagerly eagerly take out muskets as well and guns.
Yeah, if you got a score to settle with another tribe, and someone brings along a weapon that's far more effective than something like a taiahawa patu, you're probably gonna take it up.
I think I remember reading in Michael King's history, like the first battle with muskets. One Maori tribe or hapu had muskets and the other didn't, and the tribe with muskets actually lost the first battle just because they didn't really know how to use them yet, and they were kind of trying to set them up and shoot them, and the other guys were just on them at that point and like, cut them to pieces.
Yeah.
Ultimately, they worked out how to use them. Of course, they're vastly more effective than traditional spears.
Yeah, if you've read anything about Hongi Hika, I think
yes.
As a young child, he was involved. As a young boy, he was involved in one of the battles, but he was probably attending and helping to carry gear and all this kind of stuff. But he saw his people get slaughtered, and he remembered that as a young boy. And if you know the rest of the history of Hongi Hika, he organizes to get. I think he ended up getting 500 muskets, getting hold of 500 muskets by trading with the king in England. And then pawning that off to someone else in Sydney, and then getting hold of 500 muskets, and he went around and settled all those scores.
Yeah,
old battles that they lost, and early on in those battles, they had to work out distance and things, and so learn how to fight with muskets. They were used to close quarter stuff, and that's when they were. I heard about battles, it might have been that he was involved in, where they lost the battle, even though they had more muskets than the other iwi.
yeah. And you mentioned him trading in Sydney, and that brings to mind another thing that happened very, very early on, probably earlier than most people know, which was that Māori were traveling across the Tasman and doing business in Australia, and were quite entrepreneurial very early on after the English arrived in New Zealand.
Yeah, sure. They were getting busy pretty early on, and they jumped right into trading. Hongi's story is actually quite fascinating because he the planning that it took for him to get to England in the first place and have a plan to get a hold of those muskets by trading goods with the king and then pawning those. It's actually quite fascinating. But they were all doing this around the time, especially in the Bay of Islands there, where contact with Europeans was earlier and more frequent than further down the country.
Yeah.
So I just want to go back to Mātauranga Māori again just for a little bit longer, because it's such an interesting conversation, actually. There's such an interesting conversation to be had about science and Indigenous lore. And it's one that I think, obviously, people didn't want us to have, or at least they didn't want us to talk about it in certain ways or to ask certain questions. When the listener letter came out, obviously that got like a huge blowback. But I think, we and also our friend Michael Goldwater on his podcast, Shape of Dialogue, and other people have basically insisted on having this conversation. But one of the things that really interests me about it is that it actually gets us quite quickly into questions about what science is. So this is something that Karl Popper, great Austrian philosopher who lived in New Zealand for 5 or 6 years, was really interested in. And the demarcation problem is just like, what demarcates science from non-science. And so if we go a bit deeper into that, I mean, I know that some people say, even with the navigators or with Maori agriculture, it's not quite science because it was more trial and error. And I think Elizabeth Rata has argued that it's not science in the case of the navigators because they weren't searching after or looking to discover general rules. So I think for her, a key feature of science is that it promulgates and seeks to falsify these like abstract general universal rules.
Theories, in other words. So there's a kind of overarching theory that has explanatory power, and the idea is that the theory will make predictions beyond the case that you're specifically interested in, and then you're able to test that theory in other contexts. And this was Karl Popper's great insight, that you can never prove a theory to be true. You can only prove it to be false. And so the scientist's job is kind of counterintuitive because they really like their theory, but they've got to try to prove it wrong, not prove it right. And that's what scientific training gives us, among many other things, is the understanding that if we think an idea is pretty good, then the best thing we can do is to try to prove it wrong. And to the extent that we fail to prove it wrong, the theory gets stronger.
So basically, you think all swans are white, but then, you know, you can't prove that just by finding more examples of white swans, right? Because there might be non-white swans out there.
Right.
So
Right.
then if you find one black swan, that disproves the theory. So,
Right.
yeah. So I guess, again, it sounds like we're beating up on Mātauranga Māori here. I mean, this is kind of the problem with this conversation. It's hard to talk about it without sounding like you're saying one culture is better than another. But I don't think that we know of any kind of body of Mātauranga Māori that was interested in promulgating general laws. I mean, do you agree with that? Are we missing something as Pākehā?
I haven't come across something.
Yeah.
No.
And just to say something about that, I think that's been one of the obstacles to having the debate properly, is the kind of sense that people are saying the scientific worldview is superior in some way. And look, my view would be it's probably the most powerful method ever discovered for refining knowledge. But that isn't the whole story, because,
Right.
like I said before, in order for it to become possible, we had to divorce the kind of rational mind from the religious or spiritual mind, and that had a huge cost. And so it would be a mistake to say that just because we have a scientific worldview, that makes the culture as a whole better. I don't think that's true. I think it became really good at some things and really quite stupid in other ways.
It's very good for things like medicine and technology.
Yeah.
But then this is why so many white people then have to have dreadlocks and move to Golden Bay and become hippies, because they're looking for something spiritual, right?
Right. It kind of, and people like Friedrich Nietzsche in the 19th century, were talking about the death of God, and he wasn't happy about it, even though he was an atheist, because he thought it just left this big hole in people that was going to be filled by something, and it probably wasn't going to be good. And then
Right.
we saw that in the 20th century with Nazism and other forms of totalitarian ideology that took hold. And so I think we can get beyond the question about which culture is better or not as good or whatever, and have a better conversation about differences and what we can learn from one another.